Welcome to the Neijiaquan podcast. My name is Isaac Kamens. This is a bi-weekly podcast where my friend Jess O'Brien and I discuss internal martial arts, qigong, and meditation. This week we discuss the famous Xingyi master, the granddaddy of them all, Li Cunyi. We talk about Li's early life, a couple of fight stories from when he was younger, and then we read an account of Shang, one of his students who we covered in an earlier episode, talking about training with Li. Then we move on to the neigong portion of the podcast. We talk about bending and stretching, which is one of the more basic neigongs. We talk about how it applies to qigong and tai chi. And later this week, we'll be releasing on our Patreon our interview with Mary Christensen. Mary was one of the early students of Bruce Francis. She was the first person he certified to teach the Wulong form, and one of the first people he taught Bagua to. It's a really fascinating interview. Mary's got a lot of really deep insights into practicing Tai Chi and just life in general, really. Check out the Instagram for images to go along with the episodes, and we will also be posting some more Xingyi practice sessions to the Patreon coming up. All right, hope you enjoy the episode, and thanks for listening.
Welcome to the Neijiaquan podcast with Isaac and Jess. How's it going, Isaac?
It's going well, Jess. How you doing?
Good to see you back in person. Enjoying my day in San Francisco today.
And we got some construction in the background. Authentic.
Today's topic is the famous Xingyi master Li Cunyi. Now, we've been looking forward to talking about Master Li for a long time because this guy's pretty much one of the biggest names in Xingyi. I'd say you could look at him as one of the founders of Xingyi in the 20th century who really helped bring it to the public, and many of the styles that we see out here in the West are definitely from that Li Cunyi lineage.
Yeah, he's kind of the godfather of modern Xingyi, you know.
Very much. And I think he's pretty recognizable because a lot of people have seen his picture. He's got this sort of glare. Every picture of him, there's no pictures of him smiling. He's just got the hardened glare of a old school master. He's got this little mustache, and just something about his eyebrows. He's just got the glare of someone who's been through,
Yeah, well, you don't get a nickname like Single Saber Li without seeing a few things, I'm guessing.
Right. He's born fairly early, 1847. And he lives till 1921, which is some years after the founding of the Republic.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why he maybe was so prolific is, he just lived a really long time. And
right.
When you live that long, you teach a lot of people.
Well into his 70s and just doing martial arts and promoting martial arts that whole time.
Yep.
I think he may be the oldest master we've looked at yet in this second season where we're looking at the teachers of
most of them were his, would have been his students.
In his later years, old master Li Cunyi gave up caravan escorting business and focused on teaching martial arts. He had famous disciples, including a number of guys, and they list here Li Jianqiu, who we talked about last time. So Master Li Cunyi is the teacher of Li Jianqiu, who in turn is the teacher of Liu Hongzhi, who survived until 1986.
Right. He's also the teacher of Zheng Yunjing,
who we talked about a couple episodes back.
So, both of the guys that Liu's Xingyi came from were students of students of Li Cunyi. So he was he was the grandfather of the whole thing.
And he's also remarkable for knowing and associating with a bunch of other people from Bagua, Xingyi, and Tai Chi. It says here he's born in 1847. To a poor family and did not go to school but worked for a man who owned a wagon and ran a hauling service. But from a young age, Li was interested in martial arts. So he did some training. He made a number of friends who were interested in martial arts, some who went on to be famous as well. And he went on in his early 20s to meet the renowned Xingyi teacher Liu Qilan, who is also someone we're going to talk about. So this type of training, they were doing it in the 1860s, it sounds like. 1860s and 70s out in Shen County, Hebei province. He's clearly at the center of Xingyi at that time period. and eventually he became one of Liu Qilan's best Xingyi students. So eventually he ended up in Beijing, where he got connected with Bagua people and learned from them as well. In the martial arts circles, Li Cunyi was known as Single Saber Li. So this is sort of the heart of his reputation as being known for being a sword fighter. So there's a couple different stories. Like there's the Boxer Rebellion one, right? That's where most people see him as getting his nickname.
Right. So that's the first big story of him is during the Boxer Rebellion, fights off some foreigners and gets the nickname Single Saber Li.
So it says here that he was involved prior to that. Li was running a bodyguard service in Baoding, which he later moved to Tianjin. So the bodyguard service, as I understand it, back in the old days, there wasn't a lot of police force protection, so that rich people and business people would often use bodyguard companies to protect their goods when they're traveling. So that's where a lot of these Xingyi and Bagua people made their reputation, right?
Yeah, it's how they made a living too. In the age before handguns, instead of buying a gun, you'd rent a martial artist.
During the early 1890s, Li formed a bodyguard and escort service and hired skilled martial artists to work for him. In addition to those who were already highly skilled in martial arts, Li also hired strong, courageous young men who showed an aptitude for the fighting arts, and he trained them himself. So he was picking out guys who could be good bodyguards, say 17, 16 years old, putting them through a Xingyi curriculum, and then putting them out to work as bodyguards.
Right, or finding guys, sounds like, who were already good and just using them.
It says, while providing escort for those that hired him, Li frequently used his broadsword when fighting bandits. His reputation was such that local bandits would do their best to avoid crossing his path. So it sounds like he had already built up his reputation. So let's say he's born in the 1840s, so this is taking place in the 1860s, 1870s. So then there's the main story about how he earned his nickname while fighting in the Boxer Rebellion. In 1900, Li and his students joined the fight against the foreign armies. It's said that Li personally led many men into battle and fought so hard that blood dyed his shirt sleeves. Li fought using his single broadsword and was given the nickname Single Saber Li.
It wasn't necessarily common to be directly involved in the rebellion like that, so that was kind of the fact that he was active in it, I think, was different than a lot of other martial artists at the time who I think wanted to keep their distance from the sort of cult aspect of the boxers
rebellion.
Because the boxer thing, became almost like a parody of what the real thing was, which was sort of this you'd get anointed and then you'd go off and supposedly be invincible to bullets and things, but they didn't do a lot of actual training. And,
right.
Anyone who wanted to could be called a boxer, essentially. And so I think to be directly involved like that was kind of he must have had sort of intense feelings about.
Yeah, that's an interesting little bit of history there. So we've got another fight story in here. It sounds like he got into it with a boastful Baji-tren instructor. So this Baji man, surnamed Liu, was known for his skill with the spear. He challenged Li Cunyi to fight with his choice of weapon. But Li at that stage was trying to promote martial arts for setting a good example to promote righteousness and martial virtue. So he tried to deny it and get out of it. He didn't want to just get into another brawl. But this other dude was angered by Li's refusal to fight. He thrust his spear at Li. Li quickly evaded to the side and then stepped up, pressed his belly against the expended spear tip until he forced the guy to drop the spear and left embarrassed and ashamed. Later, it was said that Liu had returned home, closed down his school, and went into seclusion. So Li Cunyi went to visit him and convinced him to reopen his school and continue teaching. Oh.
Well, I mean, that speaks to this movement again. We've brought up before about how these guys were on this mission to promote martial arts as a method of national unity and personal health and growth. And so I think him avoiding the fight was probably, he was also probably pretty old by then, so
getting up there. Li Cunyi spent the last 20 years of his life teaching and promoting Xingyi Tren in Baguazhang. In 1911, he and his friend Zhang Xiaodong were responsible for establishing a martial arts curriculum in the public schools in Tianjin. Then the next year, he teams up with some other martial artists to establish the China Boxers Association in Tianjin. I think we've also seen that translated as the Warrior Society. All right, one last little piece from this Bagua Journal article from March 1994. It describes Li Cunyi's student, Shang, talks about his training with him. He said that during the first years of practice with Li, he learned the basic skills of Xingyi heaven and earth stance keeping, Trinity stance keeping, and 5 elements. So that's basically Wu Ji standing there, then there's San Ti, and then there's, the 5 elements.
Sounds like it, yeah, like a static, standing on both feet, then standing on one foot in San Ti, and then doing the 5 elements.
I mean, that sounds a lot like the curriculum now.
That's pretty much the way I learned it.
Yeah, it seems like that part of it just continues. But then now he describes some other stuff. He learned Bagua's moving stance keeping, so that's circle walking, holding postures. Mm-hmm. Let's see here. Then he went on to work on the 12 animal forms, Shi or Xingquan of Xingyi. Then Bagua circle walking, 4-part dragon style palm, linked 9 palace palm. So it sounds like that's the order of what he trained here. Shang gained a solid foundation of both Xingyi and Bagua from Li Cunyi. Moving on to the neigong training, today we're looking at one of the neigong skills known as bending and stretching. I'll read from the book definition here. Bending and stretching the body from the inside out and from the outside in, along the directions of the yin and yang acupuncture meridian lines. So Isaac, sometimes there's, in these finer neigong details, like sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between opening and closing or bending and stretching, and how do you approach that stuff?
Yeah, I think it's a continuum, right? So there'll be a beginning level of it, right? So bending and stretching is the sort of most basic level of bringing your hand towards your body and making it go away from your body.
So like bringing your hand in and out. That's bending and stretching your arm.
Mm-hmm. You're pivoting on the joint of the elbow, essentially. And the piece of it that makes it an internal thing is you're trying to do it where as you bend your arm, there is a very minute stretching along one part of it, and then when you straighten it, there's a very minute stretching on the other part of it. So this lengthening is happening as you bend and straighten your arm or leg or anything really, and that creates this like spring to it, so it doesn't collapse, right? It doesn't have there's no compression in it, but it's able to hinge without losing its
integrity, maybe.
Yeah, it's
shape.
a sort of original shape, right?
So doing it wrong would mean like you'd bring your hand inward and your arm would like collapse onto your body.
Yeah,
or stretching your arm out and sort of flinging it fully extended and sort of like crack at the elbow, like not right. Connected.
It's often compared to the action of the straight sword, right? The way a straight sword will bend and then it'll sort of snap back spring back into its original shape. And that's the idea of the bending and straightening, is that your arm can bend, but it will spring back to this original shape. It won't collapse against your body and then require you to...
So this is kind of just the basic prerequisite for any type of Qigong or martial arts movement. You have to be able to expand your limbs and bring them in and out while maintaining its integrity and structure to some degree.
Right.
But you're not necessarily doing anything... You're not twisting and spiraling and pulsing and stuff like that. It's just the mere action of opening and closing... of bending your arm inward at the elbow and stretching it open.
And it's also the bigger one, for example, is your hips, right? So the qua squat, where you hold your knees still and you bend and at your waist and sort of your butt drops. Initially that action is done just by folding, i.e. bending your waist, and then you stretch and bend your legs, and then you stretch your legs, and then will unfold your waist. So that doesn't actually have any sort of internal compression. It's just a hinge, like a just think of like a door hinge.
So it starts off as a hinging action.
Right.
Until you have it smooth and connected and reliable.
Right. A hinge is different from like a spring, right? Like a spring takes pressure in it and then releases that pressure. A hinge just swivels along with the pressure.
How do you apply that first basic level of hinging within the bending and stretching within, say, either energy gates or heaven and earth?
It's a bigger part of heaven and earth because of the, it's a more linear movement, right? So the folding of the arm. So the term that gets used more commonly than bending and straightening is folding, right? The way, like in Tai Chi, for example, somebody pushes on your wrist, you fold at the elbow, right? But you don't let your elbow collapse against your body. So it's this sort of caveat of it's not, bending and straightening things it is the most basic level of movement that you can do. It's just the piece about when you do it, you don't collapse. So if it's your leg, you bend your leg by squatting, right? Or picking up your foot. But for most of this stuff, it's by squatting. And the part that makes it a bend and stretch is that you don't move your knee forward, right? That you keep that stable point and you bend the other two things. So in your arm, it's your elbow, right? Your elbow doesn't move up and down as you bend. It holds a relatively still position.
So that's that hinge point you're talking about.
So there's a stability point, right? Something has to, again, if you think of a door, right? The hinge has to be attached to the frame,
right?
Or the whole thing's going to fly off, right?
Well, now that you mentioned in energy gates, you kind of lengthen your arms, but they don't bend. They just stay lengthened while you do the swings.
You do it with your waist.
Maybe a little bit in the swings.
You do it with your waist.
Cloud hands.
Yeah, you do it with your waist a lot in the third swing. That's probably the most obvious one, is the way you bend. What you're doing in cloud hands is the only place that's really bending and stretching is your shoulder. Right.
Yeah, because it expands and comes back and forth, whereas the arms just lengthen and stay there.
Some people do it. Some people do it where they bend the arm in the first half of the motion and then stretch it.
You
in
sort
the second
bend your
half.
elbow. I get you.
I think that method is kind of merging some
or
of this stuff.
Or you just keep the arm straight and go back and forth.
I mean, I think the more pure form of energy gates has less of that bending and stretching. Right. And if you start mixing it with dragon and tiger stuff,
right.
Or
you can do it all within it if you want.
I mean, so it's all.
Well, then when you get to heaven and earth, it's obvious now that bending and stretching is going on from the very first action.
Right. It becomes one of the primary actions rather than a secondary thing.
So it's on the front plate. It's the main course.
Where in energy gates, the primary thing is the turning, twisting, spiraling stuff. In heaven and earth, the primary stuff is the bending and straightening, opening, closing.
On a pretty linear, rather than twisting and spiraling.
So it's just kind of, that's why they're different sets. They use different neigongs.
And then going on to something like bend the bow, shoot the arrow. That's deeply involved with bending.
Right, that's the more advanced part of where the linear stuff goes. And then you get to gods playing in the clouds. That's the more advanced part of, it's all of it, but that really takes the spiraling and twisting stuff to the next level.
And combine that with some of that bending and stretching.
Right. And that's kind of where you put all of it in together. So you're doing, the opening, closing, the bending and stretching, and all the twisting and spiraling stuff.
So at the beginning of Bend the Bow, there's that arm action where they come in and out as you start to combine that, connect it with your spine and your legs. But you were saying to me earlier, you're not necessarily pumping anything or squeezing anything or compressing anything. Merely the arms just moving in space in a fixed, smooth location.
The difference really in terms of physical motion is what your finger does, right? So if you're doing a bending and straightening action, your hand will come back towards your body. Your fingers will come with it. Your wrist might bend a tiny bit, but not much.
I see.
When you're doing a pumping action like bend the bow, your fingertips don't move at all. And your wrist and your forearm sort of have to pivot around.
You can feel mass pressure through your arm into your body, down your legs.
Yeah.
Whereas at first, the arms kind of just move.
Right. There's no compression.
In coordination, but there's no compression.
Right. So bending and straightening it doesn't compress the inside of the body. It's simply, the way I think of it is it lubricates the hinges. Right. So the first thing in any internal art is you have to be able to move the outside. If you can't move all of the little wiggling parts on the outside, they're going to get in the way, right?
Yeah, it's going to be a problem.
You know, internal arts, you have to have all of the external stuff working. It doesn't have to be, extravagant.
Well, the wheels have to be free to turn before you rev the engine. Otherwise, nothing will happen.
The way I put it with people is I talk about freedom of motion versus like doing something, right? That the first part of it is you're not trying to do anything. You're trying to open, close, bend, you just want that whatever the motion is, it's not stuck. That
freedom of motion.
And that's where this bending and straightening thing is it's the first sort of piece of like, can I hinge my limbs without, collapsing or getting stiff, and then if you can do that, you can start piling things on top of that. But that initial scale of just bending your arm and leg and not collapsing your insides is kind of the it's the
baseline.
It's the letter A.
It's the letter A.
It's like it's the first. It doesn't.
So people are feeling overwhelmed by it. Really, just boils down to: are you able to move your hand in and out without having any stuckness or whatever? One other thing about the explanation I was going to ask you is the idea of these yin and yang surfaces, like the sunny side of your body and then the shady side, the yin, the yang, and then the yin. That's part of the bending and stretching too, right?
Yeah, that's the lengthening portion of it, which sometimes is a separate, topic. But they go together in that. As you straighten, right, you are generally lengthening on the yang surfaces. And if you don't know what that is, if you sort of take your arms and legs and divide them at a diagonal so that the hairy part, that's the yang part, the bald part, that's the yin part, more or less. And the idea is that when you're straightening, you're very slightly emphasizing the yang part. And then when you're bending, you're very slightly emphasizing the yin part. And that's what keeps it from collapsing, right? This constant lengthening inward and lengthening outward is what keeps that
integrity,
little bit of slack in your arm so that it doesn't get stiff from becoming floppy, right? So you're able to be loose and smooth, but it doesn't flop all over the place. It has a certain sort of viscous quality to it. And
so
a lot of this
about training that. I remember at one time we were like sweeping down your arm and then sweeping up the inside.
That's the yin and, just to get a sense of the yin and yang meridians, you can sort of run your hand up the inside and down the outside, sort of like you're rubbing, washing your arm or something. But those type of things are more, that's more to get the energetic part of it. The more sort of concrete thing, I think, that to get a sense of it is if you take your hand or your thumb and kind of pull up on the inside of your forearm, you can pull your fingers back a little bit.
Let's see, yeah,
the tissue,
those tendons,
the tissue in your forearm, it will connect all the way to your fingertips.
Interesting, sure.
And so you start getting a sense of how it's not just the finger or the most outer thing pulling on the stuff on the inside, but it's also the stuff on the inside, closer to the body, the shoulders, the back. You can lengthen outward from the inside and go, extend your body that way rather than pulling it from the hand or the elbow, right? And that is just it's more of a, like, where you start the motion, that, you know, your intent is to start it inside your body and have it move towards the outside, or start it on the outside and have it move toward the inside. But there isn't a, again, that sort of excessive pulling or collapsing action to it. It's just like a traction almost. So getting this thing of just being able to lightly kind of feel a stretch on the outside of your arm as you extend it, and then a light pull or stretch on the inside as you bend it. And you know, again, you do with those two-person things, but this will happen anyway because it's the way your body's sort of built structurally. So there's
This is the tendency of the body to expand on the outside going down.
And this is really, I mean, I think what it does is it wakes things up, right? Just by doing that, I mean, it's such a simple action, and it doesn't feel like you're doing anything. There's no feedback, right? When you start to push and pump and really compress things and pressurize the inside of your body,
you feel the power. Yeah.
There's a lot of feedback. You feel something happening. When you're doing this stuff, there's almost no feedback, and the freedom of motion is the feedback, right? The feedback is that all of a sudden you can move your arm, and it doesn't crunch and pop and click, but it also doesn't collapse, and you know it can hold some strength. So the thing we do in Xingyi to test this, where you just put your arm against someone's shoulder and you take a step forward, right? And if your arm is connected and you've lengthened and you've stretched, you don't have to tense up your arm or push or anything. That force will transfer to your body, and just
the taking of that step will take the space.
Right. But if you don't have that, what happens is when your body moves forward, your arm collapses, and your elbow bends and you flops against your body, and nothing happens, right? So that's kind of the result of this thing, is that you get to where you can stretch or bend, and it's, if you're bending, it's the action of like roll back in Tai Chi, or pulling someone's hand towards you, where you're just bending your arm to sort of follow their punch or whatever, and then at a certain point you just straighten it again, right? So it's just a sort of, go one way, go the other way, but all you do is you bend with them, and then you straighten when they get close.
It seems like Tai Chi movements really seem like the perfect place to practice that kind of stretching and bending. The way the arms are shaped and the way you shift from posture to posture, it seems like it's an ideal. So like Bagua, you kind of hold your arms out in that stretch.
Yeah. Tai Chi,
you're not bending and stretching as much.
Tai Chi
until you change.
Tai Chi of the three internal martial arts in the beginning emphasizes bending and stretching the most. Xingyi and Bagua emphasize lengthening and opening and closing more than.
You think of the classic Xingyi posture where you stand in Santi, expand.
Yeah.
You don't come back much out of that.
Your elbow
doesn't.
Your elbow doesn't bend at all. You can
stretch.
compress what's happening in your arm into your body, and you can absorb pressure.
So that's that opening and closing you're saying that is special.
You don't pull your hand back and chop it like a
hatchet,
like a catapult, right? It's not that kind of flipping motion. You swing it more like a baseball bat, right? Where in Tai Chi, there's a lot of that folding, bending motion.
Yeah, like push hands and stuff. There's all kinds of ways to escape force.
Bagua has both. It starts with the more extended stuff, and then later does the bending, twisting stuff. So it goes a little.
It all comes around in the end.
All right. Well, nice talking to you.
You had to talk.
All right. Cheers. Hey everyone, Isaac here. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Check out the Instagram, like and subscribe, and take care of yourself.